The morning Wilhelmina Hadley decided to sell her last cow was the same morning she found 3 more shingles had blown off the barn roof overnight, and she stood in the pale gray light of early dawn looking at everything she had left in the world and understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that she had nothing left to lose. The year was 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the edge of the Great Plains like a brass button on an old coat, small, functional, and holding things together more by habit than by any particular strength. The cattle drive still came through in the warm months, bringing noise and money and men who smelled of trail dust and spent everything they earned in a single furious weekend. But the farms that dotted the surrounding land were a different story altogether. They were quiet places of patient suffering, places where a woman like Wilhelmina could work from before sunrise until well after dark and still find herself on the losing side of every ledger she kept. She had been a widow for 14 months. Thomas Hadley had died of a fever that came on fast and left faster, taking him in 4 days from a man who could lift a plowshare with one hand to a man who could not lift his own head from the pillow. He had left her with 40 acres of dry-cracked Kansas earth, a 2-room house that needed more repairs than she could afford, a barn that was slowly losing its argument with the wind, 2 mules named Ruth and Bose, and a red-and-white spotted milk cow she had taken to calling Patience because the animal had more of it than Wilhelmina did. Patience had kept her alive through the worst of the winter. The milk, the butter she churned and traded at the general store, the occasional calf Thomas had always hoped for, all of it had come from that animal. But spring had arrived dry that year, drier than any of the old-timers claimed to remember, and the grass was already thin and pale, and Wilhelmina had done the arithmetic so many times she could do it in her sleep. She needed seed. Hard winter wheat seed, the good kind, enough to plant her south field, which was the only field with soil deep enough to matter. If she planted now, in the narrow window before the summer heat locked the ground solid, she might bring in enough by autumn to pay her property taxes and purchase enough supplies to carry herself and the 2 mules through another winter. The seed she needed cost $4.20 at Dobbs' General Store. She had $1.11 in the tin box under her floorboards. Patience was worth $3 to the right buyer, possibly 3.5 if the buyer was generous, which buyers rarely were when they knew a woman was selling out of desperation. Wilhelmina stood at the fence of the small paddock and watched Patience chew steadily at the last of the hay, and she placed one hand on the rough wooden rail and thought about Thomas, about how he had bartered for that cow 2 years into their marriage, trading a full season's labor, helping a neighbor build a new house in exchange for the calf. She thought about the morning their daughter Clara had been born, and how Thomas had milked Patience before sunup and brought warm milk to Wilhelmina while she was still pale and exhausted from the labor, saying it would put her strength back. She thought about all of that, and then she set her jaw and went inside to get her coat. The walk into Caldwell took 40 minutes at a good pace, and Wilhelmina walked it with her shoulders square and her eyes straight ahead. She wore her best dress, which was not very best at all, a dark blue wool that had been let out twice and was still slightly tight across the shoulders, and her good boots, which had a small crack in the left sole she had sealed with a strip of leather cut from an old harness. She carried herself the way her mother had taught her, as though she were walking into a room full of people who were expecting great things from her, because her mother had been a practical woman who understood that dignity cost nothing and purchased quite a lot. Harlan Dobbs at the general store was a man of middling years and middling kindness, the kind of man who was not cruel so much as completely indifferent to the cruelty of circumstances. He took her order for the seed, wrote it in his ledger, and looked at her from under his gray eyebrows. "You're $3.09 short, Mrs. Hadley," he said. "I know," she said. "I intend to bring you the remainder by end of week. I have a cow to sell." He nodded without enthusiasm. "Selling to who?" "I thought I might try the Bishop Ranch first. I hear they buy stock." Dobbs' eyebrows shifted slightly. Joel Bishop buys cattle, not dairy cows, but you could ask. Wilhelmina thanked him and walked back out into the bright spring morning. She had heard of Joel Bishop the way everyone in Caldwell County had heard of Joel Bishop, in pieces, in fragments of conversation, in the way people mentioned a landmark or a weather pattern rather than a person. He had arrived in Caldwell about 3 years back from somewhere in Texas, which was generally offered as sufficient explanation for his temperament, which people described variously as quiet, serious, not unfriendly but not friendly either, and fair. He had purchased the old Dalton property, 230 acres of reasonably good grassland with good water rights, and had built it into a working cattle operation in the span of 2 seasons through what appeared to be a combination of hard work, sound judgment, and a willingness to do himself whatever he could not afford to pay someone else to do. He was, as near as Wilhelmina had gathered, somewhere in his early 30s, unmarried and apparently content to remain so, which the women of Caldwell's small social world viewed as either admirable self-sufficiency or a personal affront depending on their disposition. She had never met him. She had seen him twice, once at the feed store loading sacks of oats onto a wagon, and once at the edge of a cattle auction where he stood with his arms crossed and watched the proceedings with an expression of focused calm that she had, privately and for no particular reason, found reassuring. He had been wearing a dark hat both times, brim pulled low, and had not looked in her direction on either occasion. Now she walked to the Bishop Ranch because she had a cow to sell, and he was the closest buyer who might actually pay a fair price, and she was not a woman who wasted steps. The ranch road was better maintained than she expected, the ruts filled and graded, the fence posts straight and evenly spaced. As she came up the long rise toward the main building, she could see a large barn, newly painted a deep red, and a main house that was solid and square and unpretentious, with a wide porch running along the front. There were several horses in the near paddock and the sound of someone working metal, a rhythmic ringing, coming from somewhere around the side of the barn. A hand she did not know came out from the barn to meet her, a young man with a sun-reddened face and the easy politeness of someone who had been raised correctly. "Morning, ma'am. Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Mr. Bishop," she said. "Is he on the property?" "He's at the forge. I'll get him for you." The man disappeared around the side of the barn and the metalwork sound stopped. She waited, standing straight, her hands clasped in front of her, looking out over the pasture where a small herd of good-looking cattle grazed on spring grass that was considerably greener than what she had on her own 40 acres. Joel Bishop came around the corner of the barn with a leather apron still on, and his sleeves rolled to the elbows, wiping his hands on a rag. He was taller than she had registered from a distance, with the kind of build that came from actual labor rather than any particular intention toward it, and dark eyes that moved to her face and stayed there with a directness that was not rude but was certainly not casual. "Mrs. Hadley," he said, and she was briefly startled that he knew her name before she reminded herself that in a county of this size everyone knew everyone's name even without having met. "I'm Joel Bishop. What can I do for you?" His voice was even and low, and he had the very slight Texas drawl that people had mentioned, a sort of unhurried quality in the way he formed his words. "Good morning, Mr. Bishop," she said. "I apologize for arriving without notice. I have a dairy cow I need to sell, and I was told you sometimes purchase stock. I understand she's not a cattle breed, but she's a good animal, healthy, well-tempered, 4 years old. I'm asking $3 for her." He did not respond immediately, which she had learned to interpret not as dismissal but as the habit of a person who considered things before speaking. "What breed?" he said. "She's mixed, mostly shorthorn cross, red and white. About 1,100 pounds, good milk record, never had a difficult calving." He studied her for a moment, not unkindly but with the particular attention of someone who was reading more than what was being said. She met his gaze evenly and did not look away. "I'll take a look at her," he said. "When?" I can bring her this afternoon or tomorrow morning, whichever suits you. Tomorrow morning is fine, he said. Early. I leave for the south pasture by 7. I'll be here by 6:30. He nodded. There was a brief pause in which the wind moved through the grass, and somewhere a meadowlark called its clear, ascending note. Would you like some water before you walk back? He asked. It was an unexpectedly considerate thing to say, and she felt the small surprise of it but kept her expression composed. Thank you, no, she said. I have water in my pack. I'll be here at 6:30 tomorrow, Mr. Bishop. She walked home the same way she had come, with her back straight and her steps measured, and did not let herself think about patience until she was through her own gate and out of sight of anyone. Then she sat down on the porch step and put her face in her hands for a moment, not weeping, just breathing, just allowing herself the full weight of what she was doing. Patience had not asked to be sold. Patience had not asked for any of this. But the wheat would not plant itself, and the taxes would not pay themselves, and the world would not pause in its turning to accommodate her grief. After a minute she raised her head, looked out at the pale spring sky, and went inside to start supper. The next morning she was up before 4, unable to sleep, and she milked Patience one final time in the soft dark of the barn, resting her forehead against the cow's warm flank and listening to the steady sound of the milk hitting the bucket. The barn smelled of hay and warm animal, and the particular deep richness of a place that had been lived in for a long time. She gave Patience the last of the good hay and stroked the broad, flat face and said quietly, "You've been patient with me. You've been better than I deserved." Then she put the halter on, tied the lead rope, and walked out into the pre-dawn dark with the sky turning the first faint colors of morning above the Kansas plain. She arrived at the Bishop Ranch at 6:28 by the small watch she kept pinned inside her coat pocket, which had been her mother's and still kept good time. The young hand from the previous day was not yet about, but as she came up the drive she could see a lamp lit inside the house and smoke already coming from the chimney. Joel Bishop came out before she had reached the porch, dressed for work, his dark hat already on. He came down the porch steps and walked toward her, and she handed him the lead rope without ceremony because ceremony at this point would have been unbearable. He looked the cow over with a horseman's practiced attention, ran a hand along her back and flanks, checked her teeth briefly, looked at her feet, watched the way she stood. "She's sound," he said. "I told you she was." "So you did." He looked at Wilhelmina. $3 is fair. She had been braced for negotiation, for the gentle erosion of the price that buyers always attempted when they knew the seller had no alternative, and his straightforward agreement with the number she had named landed on her like a small, unexpected kindness that she was not entirely prepared for. She kept her expression composed. "Thank you," she said. He went inside and came back with $3 silver, which he placed in her hand. She closed her fingers around them and put them in her coat pocket next to her mother's watch, and then she turned to go. "Mrs. Hadley," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with that same direct, considering expression, and he seemed to weigh something internally before he spoke. "The south field on your property," he said, "the one that runs along the creek bed on the east side, is that the one you're planting?" She was surprised. "How do you know my south field?" "I know the Hadley property. I looked at purchasing it 2 years back before your husband." He paused and gave a slight nod to the space that word occupied before. "The water table is good on the east side. That's good ground." "It is," she said. "Yes, that's the field I'm planting, winter wheat." He nodded once, the same conclusive way he had nodded the previous day, as though he had made a decision about something but saw no need to share it. "Good luck with it," he said. She walked home with $3 silver in her pocket and Patience's lead rope coiled over her shoulder. At Dobbs' store she paid the balance on the seed. Dobbs looked at the coins with mild surprise, as though he had not quite expected to see them, and then handed her a sack that weighed exactly 12 pounds and smelled of earth and dry grain and possibility. She carried it home and put it in the barn and went to bed that night with the window open so she could hear the wind moving over her south field, listening to it the way you listen to a sick person's breathing when you are hoping for improvement. She woke before dawn, as she always did, to the sound of nothing unusual. She put on her coat over her nightdress to go out and start the morning water heating, and she opened the door and nearly walked directly into Patience. The cow was standing at her gate. Not wandering, not lost-looking, but standing with the patient solidity that had earned her name. Her lead rope knotted around the gatepost, and around her neck there was a folded piece of paper tucked through the rope. Wilhelmina stood very still for a moment, one hand on the door frame. The sky was not yet light. There was just the very earliest gray, the kind that comes before dawn when the darkness is beginning to reconsider itself. She stepped off the porch and went to the gate and stood there with the cool morning air on her face and untucked the paper from the rope. It said, in plain, unhurried handwriting, "The cow belongs on your farm, J.B." She read it twice. She looked at Patience, who looked back at her with large and entirely untroubled eyes. She looked back at the note. She thought about the $3 silver in her tin box that she had paid to Dobbs for seed that was already in her barn. She thought about a man waking before sunrise earlier than she had, and she had woken very early and walking or riding a cow 2 miles in the dark, and tying her to a gate and leaving without making a sound. A single sharp thing moved through her chest, something that was not grief and was not relief either, but was something more complicated than both, something that had weight and warmth to it. She pressed her lips together hard and breathed out slowly through her nose. "Come on then," she said to the cow, and untied the rope and led her back to the paddock. She did not go to the Bishop Ranch that day. She thought about it 3 times before noon and rejected the idea 3 times. She was not a woman who received charity without acknowledgement, but she was also not a woman who could think clearly yet about what exactly she had received or what exactly she wanted to say about it. She needed to plant her wheat. She needed to keep her hands and her mind on the practical necessities of survival, because the minute she stopped concentrating on those things, she would start thinking about other things, and she was not ready for that. She planted the south field over 3 days, walking behind Bose, who pulled the seed drill Thomas had bought at an auction 2 years before their marriage. Ruth watched from the fence in the way that mules have, with an air of superiority that Wilhelmina had always found faintly comical. She planted carefully, walking the rows straight, paying attention to the depth and the spacing, doing the work the way her father had taught her to do any work worth doing, which was with complete attention and no shortcuts. On the 4th day she went to the Bishop Ranch. He was in the south pasture when she arrived, and the same young hand whose name turned out to be Eddie, 19 years old and shy in a way that he covered with busyness, went to fetch him. She waited on the porch this time because Eddie had suggested it, and she sat in one of the 2 plain wooden chairs and looked out over the land. It was good land. Greener than hers, but she did not let herself resent that because the comparison was unfair. He had more acres and more resources and had been working the land longer. She looked at it instead the way you look at a well-made thing and appreciate the making, and she thought about what it would mean to run this much land alone, which even with hands and resources was not a small undertaking. Joel came up from the pasture on horseback, a good dark bay horse she had not seen before, and dismounted at the paddock fence and tied the reins. He walked toward the porch with the easy, ground-eating stride of a man who covered a lot of distance on foot by habit, and he took off his hat as he came up the steps. "Mrs. Hadley," he said, "something wrong with the cow." "Nothing is wrong with the cow," she said. She stood because she was not comfortable delivering this particular conversation from a seated position. "I came to thank you and to give you this." She held out the $3 silver. He looked at the coins and did not reach for them. "The sale was a fair transaction," she said. "I have no intention of accepting charity, however kindly meant. I sold you the cow at a price we both agreed to, and I appreciate your returning her, but I cannot accept it. I want you to take the money back." He was quiet for a moment, with the same considering stillness she was beginning to understand was simply how he processed things. "It wasn't charity," he said. "What was it then?" He seemed to look for the right word with genuine care. "It was a correction," he said at last. "I looked at your farm. I know what the South Field can yield in a good year. I know what a cow means to a working farm that size. The transaction was fair in terms of the price, but the outcome wasn't right. She belongs there." Wilhelmina looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved his hair and he held his hat by the brim and looked back at her with those steady dark eyes that did not flinch from anything. "I cannot accept $3 worth of livestock as a gift, Mr. Bishop," she said, and her voice was even though she had to work to make it so. "I have a daughter. I have 40 acres. I have my name and my work. Those are all I have, and I intend to keep them all intact. So please take the money." Something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly, it was not hard to begin with, but a kind of adjustment, a recognition of what she had just said and what it had cost her to say it. "Your daughter," he said. "How old?" "6," she said. "Her name is Clara. Is she at school?" "She's at the Pemberton school in the mornings." She paused. "I am not asking for anything else, Mr. Bishop. I have my seed in the ground. When the harvest comes I will be fine. I just need you to take the money." He looked at the coins in her palm for another moment, then he looked at her. "All right," he said. He reached out and took 2 of the 3 coins. "The third one's for the milk she gave while she was at my place. Fair is fair." She looked at the single silver dollar left in her hand. He was watching her with something that might, in a very particular light, have been the beginning of a smile, not wide, not performed, just a slight shift in the line of his mouth. She put the dollar in her pocket. "Thank you," she said. "Ma'am." She walked back down the porch steps and he went to untie his horse, and she was halfway down the drive when she heard him say from behind her, "Mrs. Hadley." She turned. He was still standing by the horse, one hand on the reins. "If you need anyone to check the drill calibration before the next planting, I've got a good eye for it. No charge." She considered him. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. She walked home with something warm and complicated sitting in the center of her chest, and she refused to examine it too closely, because she had wheat coming up and property taxes to think about, and a daughter to collect from school at noon, and there was simply no time for examining complicated warm feelings. The wheat came up thin in the first week, and she held her breath, watching the rows every morning the way she watched Clara sleeping when the child had a fever, with total attention and a kept quiet terror. Then the second week brought 3 days of steady light rain, the best kind, the kind that soaked in instead of running off, and by the end of the second week the south field was showing a proper stand of green that made her exhale so completely she had to sit down on the fence rail. Clara was a bright, serious child who had her father's brown eyes and her mother's straight spine, and a way of asking questions that cut directly to the heart of things. She had understood, with the particular grief that children have, what it had meant when her father died. She had not made a performance of it, but had simply become slightly quieter for several months, and then gradually expanded back to her full self, which was considerable. She knew they were poor in the way that children know things, not from being told but from observing, from the things that were not replaced when they broke, from the way her mother counted coins at the store, from the mending on the elbows of every coat. She had asked about the cow's disappearance and then returned with straightforward pragmatism. "Where did Patience go?" "I sold her and then she was returned to us," Wilhelmina said, aiming for neutral. Clara considered this. Why was she returned? A neighbor felt she belonged here. Clara looked at her mother with those brown eyes. "Which neighbor?" "Mr. Bishop from the Bishop Ranch. The tall man with the dark hat." Wilhelmina looked at her daughter. "You've seen him. He came to the school last month to bring Eddie's lunch that Eddie forgot. Eddie works for him. He's tall." "Yes," Wilhelmina agreed. "He is tall." Clara appeared to find this sufficient and went back to her arithmetic. Wilhelmina watched her for a moment and then went back to her mending. Spring moved toward early summer in the measured way of the Kansas plain, one long golden day following another, and the wheat grew. Wilhelmina kept her schedule with the disciplined rigidity of a woman who understood that discipline was what stood between her and chaos. Up before 5, the animals fed and watered, the kitchen garden tended. She had expanded it this year, adding a second row of beans and more squash because the kitchen garden cost her only labor and the soil on that side was good. And then whatever repairs and maintenance needed doing. And then the school walk to collect Clara at noon. And then the afternoon work, and then supper, and then the accounts, which she kept in a small cloth-bound book she had bought at the general store and maintained with meticulous care. She saw Joel Bishop twice in May. Once at the general store, where they exchanged pleasantries with the particular polite awkwardness of two people who were still calibrating how to talk to each other, and once on the road when he was riding past her property and she was working the fence on the east side. He stopped his horse. "That fence line is sitting crooked," he said, looking at the section she had just finished. She looked at it. It was slightly crooked. "I know," she said. "I ran out of the right size posts and used what I had. I have some surplus cedar posts at the ranch. They'll outlast those pine ones by 20 years. She looked at him. He was looking at the fence with the focused, slightly dissatisfied expression of a man for whom a crooked fence line was a genuine problem. "I'm not in the business of taking things I haven't paid for," she said. "I know," he said. "I wasn't offering them for free. I was going to suggest you could come get them and we could work something out." "Work what out?" He looked at her. "My cook left last week. Took a job at the hotel in Wichita. I've got 6 hands who are currently eating things that should not be inflicted on any person, including themselves." She folded her arms. "You're suggesting I cook for your hands in exchange for fence posts. Only if it suits you. I'm not proposing anything you'd find disagreeable." She thought about it for a moment, doing the quick calculation. The cedar posts would save her the cost of replacement posts she would otherwise need to buy, and the cooking itself was not beyond her capacity. She had cooked for her husband's harvesting crew for 3 seasons and had been complimented on it. "How many men, how many meals?" 6 men, breakfast and supper. I eat the same as the rest." "For how many posts?" 20. "That'll fix your east fence and leave you some for the north line too." She considered him. He had the straightforward quality of a man who named a fair price and meant it, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he operated. "I'll start Monday," she said. The arrangement was straightforward and, as far as Wilhelmina could determine, entirely practical. She came to the Bishop Ranch in the pre-dawn on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and made breakfast for 7 people including Joel, and came back in the late afternoon to make supper, leaving Clara at the Pemberton household. Her friend Hannah Pemberton's mother had offered this with the cheerful generosity of a woman who liked children and had plenty of room on those days. Cooking for 7 men with real appetites was not a small operation, but Wilhelmina had grown up the eldest of 5 in a farmhouse with a wood stove and a father who could eat more than seemed physiologically possible, and she knew what she was doing. She made biscuits and eggs and salt pork in the mornings and beans or stew and cornbread in the evenings, and the hands ate with the focused devotion of people who had been subsisting on hardship, and the general atmosphere at the Bishop Ranch improved perceptibly within the first week. She and Joel ate their own meals with the hands, which was his custom. He did not separate himself from the men who worked for him, which she noted and respected, and at these meals they talked. Not exclusively to each other, but in the way that people talk at a working table about practical things first. The weather, the grass, the condition of the cattle, the state of the road to Wichita, and then, gradually, about other things. She learned that he had grown up in East Texas, the son of a cattle drover who had spent most of his time on the trail, and a mother who had managed their small property with considerable skill. His mother had died when he was 22. His father was still alive but aging and living with a sister in Abilene. He had worked 3 cattle drives on the Kisham Trail before he had saved enough to purchase land of his own, and he had chosen Caldwell because of the water and the grass, and because the land was still reasonably priced, and because, he said with a slight dryness that she was coming to recognize as his form of humor, he had ridden through enough trail dust to last him several lifetimes, and wanted to stay in one place. She told him about Ohio, where she had grown up, and the farm her father had kept there, and how she had met Thomas at a church social when she was 20 and married him 6 months later and come west because Thomas had believed in the promise of Kansas land the way some people believed in Scripture, with a total and uncritical faith. She told him about Thomas without performing either grief or recovery, just told him as a fact of her life, which he would always be the man she had loved and built something with and lost, part of the permanent structure of who she was. Joel listened the way he always listened, with complete attention and without the impatient readiness to speak that characterized most people's listening. "He sounds like a man who worked hard," he said. "He did," she said. "He just ran out of time." He was quiet for a moment and then said, "That seems to be how it goes with the best ones." She looked at him and he was looking at his coffee cup, and she thought that he was probably thinking about his mother, and she did not press the point. By the end of June, the 20 fence posts had been delivered and her east fence was straight and the north line reinforced, and the cooking arrangement concluded, and she thought that was the end of a practical transaction, which it should have been, and which she told herself it was. It was not. He came by on the first Saturday of July under the pretext of checking whether the cedar posts had taken the wet weather correctly, which she knew perfectly well was not a thing that required personal inspection. But she showed him the fence line anyway, and they walked the east side of her property together, with the long Kansas summer light lying golden over everything. Clara came with them, uninvited but unrefused, asking Joel questions about cattle with the relentless focus of a child who had identified a willing information source. He answered every question with complete seriousness. He did not condescend and did not simplify, and did not lose patience when she circled back to the same question with a slightly different angle, which she did, because she was her mother's daughter. Wilhelmina walked between them and listened to Clara asking about the difference between Herefords and Longhorns, and watched Joel explain it with a hand gesture and a word for the confirmation of the head, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the specific warmth of her life containing more than just her own effort. She told herself it was the summer air. She told herself it was relief at the wheat coming in well. She told herself many reasonable and practical things. In the evening after Clara was in bed, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea and looked at the south field, which was thick and green and promising everything she had asked it to promise, and she admitted to herself, quietly and privately, and without any immediate intention of doing anything about it, that she thought about Joel Bishop quite a lot more than practical matters required. He was not a demonstrative man. He was not the kind of man who paid compliments freely or made large gestures. But he had returned her cow in the dark before sunrise and asked for nothing, and he had paid fair for her labor without adjusting the price downward because he knew she needed the work, and he had spent an hour explaining bovine anatomy to a 6-year-old with complete seriousness, and she found that all of these things were building towards something in her chest that she was running out of practical explanations for. July brought heat and the beginning of the hard, dry stretch that always came in midsummer, and Wilhelmina watched the sky every morning with the anxious attention of all farmers, and prayed for the particular kind of cloud that meant rain and not just thunder. The wheat was far enough along now that it could manage the dry period if it did not run too long, but she watched it anyway because watching it was the only form of control she had. She and Joel saw each other more frequently now, without any particular arrangement accounting for it. He would ride past and stop, or she would have occasion to go into town and encounter him at the store or the water trough, and they would talk for longer than the encounter strictly required before both of them found reasons to move along. She noticed that he had started to smile more readily, not broadly. He was not a broad-smiling kind of man, but the slight shift in the line of his mouth came quicker now and stayed longer, and she noticed this the way she noticed things she was trying not to notice, which was with perfect accuracy. It was Hannah Pemberton's mother, Dorothea, a woman of 50 with sharp eyes and a warm heart who had been one of the first to bring food to Wilhelmina's door after Thomas died, who said what Wilhelmina was not yet saying to herself. They were in Dorothea's kitchen putting up preserves on a Thursday afternoon in late July, both of them sweating in the late summer heat, and Dorothea said without looking up from the jar she was sealing, "Joel Bishop was asking about you at the post office." Wilhelmina's hands continued their work. "About me specifically or generally? About how you were managing the harvest? About whether you had enough help for it?" "I can manage the harvest." "I told him that," Dorothea said pleasantly. He didn't look entirely convinced. Wilhelmina set down the ladle and looked at Dorothea, who was looking back at her with the composed expression of a woman holding more opinions than she was currently expressing. "He's a good man," Dorothea said. "I know he is. He's a lonely man. They're not always the same thing, but in this case I think they're related." Wilhelmina picked up the ladle again. "I have a farm to run and a daughter to raise, and I'm not in any position to be thinking about things like that." "Wilhelmina," Dorothea said, with the particular gentleness that was more effective than bluntness, "you have been in that position for 14 months and you have been remarkable in it, and the whole county knows it. But there is no virtue in refusing to let your life contain more than struggle." Wilhelmina pressed her lips together and said nothing and put up the rest of the preserves in silence, and later that night she sat on her porch for a long time and looked at the stars coming out over the dark plain and thought about what Dorothea had said, turning it over like a stone, examining what was underneath. She did not come to any conclusions, but she stopped refusing to think about it. The harvest came in the 3rd week of August, and it was good. Not spectacular, the dry stretch had taken some toll, but solid, better than she had hoped enough. She had arranged for 2 of the Pemberton boys to help with the cutting and binding, and Joel Bishop appeared on the 2nd day of harvest with Eddie and another of his hands, and simply began working the far end of the field without asking, and she looked at him across the wheat for a moment, and then went back to her work, which was the only answer she had that made any sense. By the end of the 2nd day, the field was cut and bound and standing in shocks to dry, and Dorothea Pemberton had come over with a supper that was far too good to have been thrown together on short notice, and they all sat on the grass outside the barn in the long late August evening and ate together. 7 or 8 people and 2 small children, including Clara, and there was a very good hour of easy company and the particular satisfaction of finished work. Joel sat near enough to talk to Wilhelmina without it being conspicuous, and they talked about the yield and about the Southfield soil quality and about what she planned to do with the income, and he listened to her plans with the genuine interest of a person who understood farming and respected a well-made plan. And at some point, their conversation separated slightly from the general table and became its own quieter thing. He said, looking out at the cut field in the last of the evening light, "You built something real here, in a hard year." She followed his gaze. The field looked good, even cut clean, well managed. "I built what I needed to build," she said. "Most people in your position would have sold the land and moved to town." "I know," she said. "I thought about it." He looked at her. "What stopped you?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. "Thomas loved this land, not in a sentimental way, in the way you love a thing because you understand what it is and what it can do. I thought I should give it a chance before I gave up on it, and then I thought I should give myself a chance." She paused. "And it turns out I love it too. The land, on its own terms, not just his." He was quiet in the way that was not absence but attention. The evening light was gold and amber on everything, and somewhere behind the barn an owl called once, soft and low. "I'd like to come calling," he said, "if that's all right with you." The directness of it, after all the circling, after all the careful practical arrangements that had provided them with reasons to be near each other, was somehow both startling and exactly right. She looked at him. He was looking at her steadily, with the same openness he had when he said the cow belonged on her farm, no performance, no pretense, just a man saying plainly what he meant. "Clara is part of this," she said. "You should know that." "I know that," he said. "I'm asking about both of you." Something shifted in her, something that had been braced for a long time. "Then yes," she said. "That's all right with me." He nodded, and the slight, real shift in the line of his mouth appeared. September came in cool and promising, and Joel Bishop called at the Hadley farm on Sunday afternoons, which was the day most sensibly set aside for such things, and they took it slowly and with the particular care of two people who had both been through enough to understand what was worth caring about. He would arrive mid-morning, often with something useful, a pound of good coffee, a new leather hinge for the barn door that had been troubling her, and Clara would immediately attach herself to him and require information about things, and he bore this with what Wilhelmina could only describe as genuine enjoyment. She watched him with Clara closely and without apology, because Clara was the most important thing in her life, and she was not a woman who let important things go unexamined. What she saw was a man who was simply present, not performing affection, not trying to win the child's approval, just being actually there, answering her questions, watching her with attention, occasionally asking her his own questions in return, which Clara found deeply satisfying. On the third Sunday, Joel helped her repair the barn roof, the shingles she had been patching for a year and a half with inadequate materials, and they worked together through a long blue-sky morning with a competence that required very little conversation, each of them understanding the task and their own part in it, and Wilhelmina found the wordless coordination of it quietly remarkable, the way working alongside someone can tell you things about them that talking cannot. By noon, the roof was sound for the first time since before Thomas died, and she stood in the barn and looked up at it and felt the specific satisfaction of a problem solved completely, not partially, not provisionally, but actually fixed. "Thank you," she said. He was coming down from the ladder and he looked at her. "It needed doing." "I know, but thank you anyway." He stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked at her with an expression that had something new in it, something quieter and more particular than the even attention she had grown used to. And then he crossed the barn and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him because he was indeed, as Clara had noted, very tall, and he said, "May I?" she said. "Yes," without pretending she did not know what he was asking. He put his hand against her face carefully, with the same attention he applied to everything, and kissed her in the cool shadow of the barn with the repaired roof overhead. And it was quiet and real, and nothing like the performed romance she had sometimes observed in other people. And she put her hand on his chest and felt his heart beating steadily under it, and thought that this was what she had not known she was waiting for, not rescue, not relief, just this. Something real, something present, something that asked for exactly what she was able to give. Clara's voice called from the yard, "Mama, the mules are out," with the bright urgency of a child for whom escaped mules were not a crisis so much as an interesting development, and they separated and went out to deal with Ruth and Bose, who had, in the manner of mules everywhere throughout history, simply walked through the gate because they had wanted to, and the three of them spent 20 minutes chasing the animals around the yard, while Clara ran alongside providing advice that was energetic but only sporadically helpful. And by the time they had gotten the mules back in the paddock, they were all laughing, and Wilhelmina thought that laughter was, perhaps, the most important thing, the clearest sign that a life had room in it again. October brought the thrashing and the sale of the wheat, and when Dobbs totaled the weight and handed her the sum, she had to read the figure twice before she believed it. $62. After the seed cost and the twine and the hired help for the cutting, she would clear nearly $40, enough to pay the property taxes with room to spare and purchase the winter supplies she needed, and put $6 in the tin box under the floorboard for the first time in longer than she could remember. She stood outside Dobbs' store with the money in her hands and the October sun on her face and the smell of harvest dust on everything, and felt, for the first time since Thomas died, that she was not surviving. She was building. There was a difference, and it mattered. She went to find Joel, not because she needed to, but because he was the person she most wanted to tell. He was at the stock pens at the edge of town with a cattle buyer from Wichita, a large transaction by the sound of it, and she waited at a respectful distance until the business was concluded and the buyer moved off. And then Joel turned and saw her and read her expression and said, "Good harvest." "Very good," she said. $62. He was quiet for a moment and then he smiled, a real one, fuller than usual, and she felt it the way you feel a fireplace when you come in from the cold, all through your chest. "You did that," he said, "all of it." "We did some of it," she said honestly. He shook his head. "You planted it and planned it and carried it. I helped for 2 days. Your fence posts held the east line straight. Good drainage." He laughed then, the low, real laugh that she had heard only a few times, and which she understood was not a common thing from him, and she thought that she wanted to spend a great deal of time earning it. November was cold, and the winter preparations consumed them both. She with her own farm, he with the ranch, both of them busy with the particular pressing urgency of making everything ready before the plains winter arrived in earnest. They still met on Sundays, but the days were shorter now, and the visits were shaped differently, more often inside by the fire with Clara doing her letters on the table while Wilhelmina and Joel talked in the easy, ranging way that people who are comfortable with each other talk, about everything and nothing, about their plans and their worries and their opinions on things, and occasionally about harder things. His father's health, her fear that the dry spring would repeat itself next year. The way grief works, and doesn't work and works again unexpectedly. She had Clara in bed one evening in early November and came back to the sitting room where Joel had stayed late by the fire, which he did sometimes when the conversation had a particular momentum, and she sat down in the other chair, and for a moment they were simply quiet together, the fire talking in its own language, the wind outside doing what the wind in Kansas does, which is exactly what it wants. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "And I want to say first that I know it's not simple. I know you built this farm yourself and it's yours, and I'm not asking you to give anything up. I want us to be on the same side of things. That's all." She had known it was coming not from any particular indication but from the basic logic of what they were to each other and where things had been pointing, and she had thought about it, carefully and honestly, in the way she thought about everything. She had asked herself whether she was doing it out of need, which would be wrong, or out of genuine wanting, which would be right. She had examined his character against everything she knew of it, and found it consistent and good and rare. She had thought about Clara, who had begun last week calling him Mr. Joel instead of Mr. Bishop, a development that Clara had apparently decided on her own without fanfare. "I want that too," she said, "being on the same side." He looked at her with those direct dark eyes. "Yes, yes," she said. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat by the fire for a long time while the wind moved over the Kansas plain outside and the fire burned down to coals. They married in December at the Caldwell Church, in a ceremony attended by Dorothea Pemberton and her family and Joel's hands, and half the county it seemed, because apparently their courtship had been observed and tracked by everyone with a view of either property. Dorothea wept with the uncomplicated happiness of a woman who had been right about something she cared about. Eddie, who was serving as a witness, stood very straight in a collar that appeared to be causing him some discomfort. Clara stood beside her mother in a blue dress that Wilhelmina had made from a piece of good wool she had allowed herself as a small extravagance, and she was solemn and attentive in the way she was solemn about things that mattered to her. And when Wilhelmina and Joel said their vows, she watched with an expression that was not a child's performance of understanding but the real thing. A child who had lived through loss and knew what it meant when people chose each other with full knowledge of what choice cost. Afterward there was a supper at the church hall that Dorothea organized with the cheerful military efficiency she brought to all social enterprises, and there was fiddle music and the particular warmth of a community gathered around something good. And Wilhelmina danced with Joel for the first time, and discovered that he danced with the same quality he had for everything: not showy, not hesitant, just fully present and paying attention. And she thought that she would never stop being grateful for that quality in him. Clara danced with Eddie, who was a better dancer than he looked, and with Tommy Pemberton, who was not, and then fell asleep against Wilhelmina's shoulder at the end of the evening with the total abandonment of a child who has had a good day. They went home to the Hadley farm first, because Wilhelmina had insisted on this, on keeping the farm in her name and running it as a functioning property, and not folding it into the Bishop Ranch in a way that would erase it. And Joel had agreed, without the slight reluctance she had half expected, to put Clara to bed. And then they sat together in the kitchen by the stove in the quiet dark of a December night and drank tea and talked for a long time about the most ordinary things in the world. About the spring planting and the fence repairs and what they would need from town before the weather got worse. And Wilhelmina thought that this was what she had actually been waiting for. Not the ceremony or the declaration, but this, the ordinary evening, the shared table, the simple and profound fact of not being alone. Winter settled deep over the plains and they went through it together, moving between the two properties as the work required, and the combination of their efforts was, as Joel had predicted, a better situation than either had managed separately. The Hadley farm's south field was earmarked for a larger planting in the spring. Wilhelmina wanted to increase the wheat acreage by 1/3 and try some winter barley in the north section. And the Bishop Ranch's cattle herd had a good winter in the reinforced south pasture buildings that he and his hands had improved over the fall. Clara adapted to the changed shape of her life with the flexibility of a child whose resilience had been tested early and who had come through it with her essential nature intact. She moved between the two houses with ease and established her own routines in each, and she had, by February, dropped the Mr. entirely and simply called him Joel, which she announced one morning as though it were a practical decision she had made on administrative grounds. "Joel," she said, testing it at breakfast with a piece of cornbread in her hand. He looked at her over his coffee. "Yes," he said simply, as though she had asked a question, and went back to his coffee, and she went back to her cornbread, and the matter was settled. Spring came again, and with it the smell of turned earth and the particular quality of hope that is specific to farmers and specific to the season, the belief renewed by the evidence of green things pushing through dark soil that the effort is worth making again. Wilhelmina expanded the south field as planned and tried the barley in the north section, walking her rows in the early morning with the cool spring air on her face and a quality of particular rightness in her chest that she had come to understand was simply happiness, not the dramatic kind, not the fragile kind, but the solid, daily kind that is built out of good choices and honest work and the right people beside you. Joel came out with her some mornings before the ranch work demanded him, and they walked the rows together, and he saw things she saw, and she saw things he saw, and together they saw more than either would have alone, which seemed to her a good summary of what they were to each other. In April she found she was expecting a child, which she discovered first with a flutter of fear that she recognized as the residue of having lost too many things, and then with a slower, deeper feeling that was not quite joy yet, but was the foreground of it. She told Joel that evening after supper, after Clara was in bed, in the sitting room by the lamp. He was quiet for a moment in the way that always meant he was feeling something completely rather than reaching for the expected response. "Are you well?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "I'm well." He reached out and took her hand and held it and did not say anything more for a little while, and she could see him absorbing the fact of it, making room for it inside himself with the care he brought to important things. "Good," he said at last, and the single word held everything. She had told Clara the following Saturday, framing it carefully because Clara was a child who required honest information and did not respond well to hedging. Clara considered it for a long moment with the analytical expression she got when processing significant data. "A brother or a sister," she said, Possibly, Wilhelmina said. Which would you prefer? I don't think I get to choose. Clara thought about this. I think a brother would be interesting, she said. I know what a sister is. A brother would be new information. Wilhelmina looked at her daughter with a love so full it was almost painful. That is a very reasonable way to think about it, she said. The spring planting went well, better than the previous year. The soil in the south field was improving with management, and the barley in the north section came in strong and straight. And by June it was clear that this would be a better year than the last, which had already been better than the year before, which was how things were supposed to go when you worked the ground right and gave it what it needed. There were difficulties too, because there were always difficulties in the 1870s plains, in a territory that was still finding its shape. There was a dispute that sprang between the cattle drovers who still ran herds up the old trails and the farmers whose fields increasingly crossed those routes. And the tension sometimes ran high in Caldwell on cattle drive weeks, with the trail hands in the saloons and the farmers keeping closer to their own edges. Joel navigated this with the even-handed pragmatism of a man who had been on both sides of the divide. He had driven cattle, and now he ran a ranch and understood both kinds of grievance, and he had on 2 occasions quietly talked men down from confrontations that might otherwise have escalated. Wilhelmina watched this side of him with appreciation. The world was not simple, and the people in it were not simple, and the ability to hold more than one perspective at the same time without collapsing into partisanship was, she had come to believe, one of the rarer and more valuable qualities a person could have. The summer was hot and busy, and the baby arrived on the 14th of August, when the wheat was golden and already being talked about by Caldwell farmers as the best harvest in 5 years. Dorothea Pemberton came to attend the birth in her capacity as the most experienced person for the role for 50 miles, and Joel was in the kitchen doing the work of a man who very much wants to be helpful and is finding the limits of that aspiration. And Clara sat on the porch in the warm August night and waited with the particular focus of a child who has decided that this is important and she will be present for it. The baby was a boy. He was born in the early morning, just before the light, in the same bedroom where Thomas had died, and where Wilhelmina had cried for many nights, and where she had lain awake planning and worrying and holding herself together. And he arrived with the full-throated announcement of a person who intends to take up space and make his presence known. Dorothea cleaned him and handed him to Wilhelmina, and she held him and looked at his red, furious, absolutely perfect face, and felt the full flood of it, all of it. The 2 years of struggle and loss and effort, and the new love built carefully from honest material, and the child in the other room on the porch who had held her hand through the worst of it. And this new child beginning right now, in the warm August before dawn light. Joel came in, finally aloud, and stood at the side of the bed, and looked at the baby with an expression that she had never seen on him before and would see many times afterward, complete and unguarded openness. The face of a person touched all the way through by something that bypassed all the careful, even steadiness, and went directly to the essential thing underneath. He reached out and put one hand against the baby's head, so gently, and looked at Wilhelmina. "He's real," he said, which was not the most articulate thing he had ever said but was possibly the truest. "He is," she said. Clara came to the doorway, barefoot from the porch, her hair loose and her eyes wide. "Is it a brother?" "It's a brother," Wilhelmina said. Clara came in and stood beside the bed and looked at the baby with the careful, analytical attention she brought to all new information. Then she reached out with one careful finger and touched his hand, and the baby's fingers, with the involuntary grip of all newborns, closed around it. Clara's expression went through several things: surprise, then something more complicated, then a smile that started slowly and became the fullest, most real smile Wilhelmina had ever seen on her daughter's face. "Hello," Clara said to the baby with complete seriousness. "I'm your sister. I know a lot of things and I'll tell you all of them." They named him Thomas Joel Hadley Bishop. Thomas for the man who had loved this land and shaped this family before he had to leave it. Joel for the man who had returned a cow to a gate in the dark before sunrise because he understood that some things belonged where they were. He was called Tom from the first week, because Clara decided this, and Clara's decisions in matters of nomenclature were, they had discovered, essentially final. The harvest that year was everything she had hoped for. The south field yielded better than the previous year. The barley came in clean and well priced. And when all the accounts were settled and the supplies laid in for winter, Wilhelmina sat at her kitchen table with the cloth-bound ledger book and looked at the numbers and felt the particular quiet triumph of a life that was, actually, working. She and Joel talked that winter about the properties, about what it would mean, practically, to manage them as a single farming and ranching operation rather than two adjacent ones, which was increasingly what they were in practice, if not officially on paper. She had kept the Hadley farm in her name as a matter of principle, and he had respected that without question. But the practical reality was that the decisions they made about both properties were made together, at the kitchen table, or walking a fence line, or lying in the dark talking about next year in the way farmers always do, always forward-looking, always reading the world for signs of what it intends. "I want to sink a second well on the east side," she said one evening in January, with Tom sleeping in the crib nearby and Clara in bed, the fire good and the cold outside doing what Kansas cold does, which is everything. "The east side of which property?" "Mine, the Hadley farm. There's a low spot about 40 yards in from the old barley field where I think the water tables close. If I'm right, it would make the whole north section irrigable." He was quiet in the considering way. "I'll walk it with you in the spring." "I'm going to walk it myself first," she said, not adversarially, just plainly. He looked at her with a half-smile. "Of course you are. I want to be right before I bring in a dowser." "You always want to be right." "I usually am." He laughed, and Tom stirred briefly in the crib at the sound and then settled again. And the winter went on outside, and the fire went on inside, and she thought about this ordinary, extraordinary thing, the life she was living, the life she had built out of difficult materials with her own hands and her own will, and with the help, at a crucial moment, of a man who had understood that a cow at a gate before sunrise was not charity but was something more precise than that. A recognition that some things have a proper place in the world, and that placing them correctly is its own form of justice. Spring came again, as it always did, indifferent to whether you were ready for it or not, full of its particular demanding beauty. Tom was 7 months old and had Clara's serious eyes and Joel's tendency toward focused attention, which manifested in him as an extreme interest in whatever his hands were doing, which at 7 months was mostly his own feat but with tremendous commitment. He grew fast and well, and had the robust health of a child born into a stable and loved situation. And Wilhelmina, who had spent 2 years learning to hold her happiness carefully in case it broke, found herself beginning to hold it a little more firmly, a little more confidently, beginning to believe in it as a permanent feature of the landscape rather than a weather event. She walked the east side of the Hadley farm in March, alone in the early morning with the frost still on the ground, and found her low spot, and found what she thought were the signs she was looking for. She brought in a dowser from Wichita, a spare, weathered man named Abbott who charged $3 for a consultation, but was known to be reliable, and stood back and watched him walk her east field with his forked willow branch. And when the branch dipped decisively over the low spot she had identified herself, she had the small satisfaction of confirmed instinct. The well cost $12 to sink and was worth every cent. By April there was good water at 22 feet, and by the time the spring planting was in the ground the north section had irrigation it had never had before, and she expanded the barley and added a test section of oats, and stood in her field in the April morning with Tom on her hip and the smell of turned earth all around her, and felt that she was, finally, thoroughly, and without any reservation, home. Joel Bishop had come from Texas and had looked at this land and chosen it, and she had come from Ohio and had chosen it through her husband first and then through herself. And in the choosing and the working and the building they had found each other. And she thought that the land was a good explanation for a lot of things in the world if you looked at it right. The way it demands everything you have and returns it differently. Transformed. The work you put in becoming something else. Something that feeds you and grounds you and continues past you. There was a morning in May when she was up before anyone, before Joel, which was rare because he was generally up before her, and she went out onto the porch in the gray before dawn and stood in the same quality of light that had greeted her the morning she found Patience at the gate, and she looked at the property, both properties, because from the rise on the Hadley side you could see a corner of the Bishop Ranch's south pasture, and at the wheat coming in green and strong, and the barley straight and pale, and the kitchen garden full and productive, and at the barn with its sound roof, and the paddock with Ruth and Bose still dreaming and Patience in the small field she had shared last year with the heifer calf Joel had gifted her in the fall. She thought about the woman who had stood on this porch 14 months into widowhood with $1.11 in a tin box and a cow to sell, who had walked into town with her back straight, and her boots mended with a strip of harness leather, and her dignity intact because it was all she had, and she was not giving it up. She thought about that woman with tremendous tenderness and also with a kind of clear-eyed recognition. She was still that woman. She was that woman plus everything that had happened since, which was grief and effort and wheat seed, and a man who understood that some things belong where they belong. She was still standing there when she heard Joel's step on the floorboard behind her, and he came out and stood beside her with his coffee, sleep still in his face, and looked out at the same view she was looking at. "You're up early," he said. "I always am." He looked at her. "What are you thinking about?" "Patience," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The cow, the whole thing, the morning I found her at the gate." She paused. "You did that before the sun came up. You didn't have to." He was quiet in the particular way that meant he was going to say something he meant. "I told you," he said. "It was a correction. It seemed wrong." "You could have just done nothing," she said. "Most people would have. I'm not most people." She looked at him, at the line of his jaw and the dark eyes and the unhurried quality of a person who lived exactly in the present moment, and she thought that she had known that about him from the beginning, from the way he listened, and the way he paid fair prices without being asked, and the way he answered Clara's questions with complete seriousness, and the way he stood beside her on this porch and drank his coffee in the May before dawn and looked at the world they had built. "No," she said. "You're not." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the sun came up over the Kansas plain in the way it always did, without fanfare, simply arriving, filling everything with light, and the cattle in the south pasture began to move, and the birds began to call, and somewhere in the house Tom made the small demanding sound that meant he was awake and ready for the world. And Clara's feet appeared on the stairs with the speed of a child who had heard the baby and considered herself the appropriate first responder. The day began, as all days did, with more needing doing than there were hours to do it, and they went to meet it together. The months that followed were the good kind, the kind that are full of ordinary events that, looked at closely, turn out to be extraordinary. The barley yield that summer was the best the North Section had ever produced under any management, and the oat test came in better than projected, and when the numbers were settled in September, Wilhelmina expanded the cloth-bound ledger book into a second volume because the first had run out of pages, which she considered a satisfying form of abundance. Tom took his first steps in October, with the focused determination of a person who has decided to do a thing and is going to do it correctly if it kills him, which it nearly did 3 times before he got the balance right. Clara documented this in a notebook she had taken to keeping about her brother's development, a project that Joel had encouraged with great seriousness, and which Tom would find 20 years later preserved in the cedar chest and read with a mixture of amusement and deep gratitude. The property taxes were paid in November, on time, in full, without hardship, for the 2nd year in a row. Wilhelmina stood at the county registrar's desk and handed over the money and walked out into the November morning, and stood for a moment in the street with the cool air on her face and the memory of what it had felt like to not be able to do this, to face the same desk and the same requirement with empty hands. The memory was important to her. She intended to keep it. She and Joel went to church at Christmas and sat in the same pew with Clara between them and Tom on Wilhelmina's lap. And there were carols she had known all her life sung by voices she had come to know over 2 years of this community. And the church was warm and smelled of pine boughs and candle wax. And Clara sang with full commitment and perfect confidence in notes that were occasionally approximate. And Tom fell asleep against Wilhelmina's shoulder with his fist closed around a button on her coat. And Joel sat with his arm along the back of the pew, and she felt the warmth of him beside her, and looked at the candles and thought about all the things in her life that had required her to be exactly as strong as she had been, no more and no less, and thought about how precisely things had aligned to bring her to this pew this evening, this particular quality of full and ordinary and real. After the service there were greetings outside in the cold, breath showing in the lamplight, and Dorothea Pemberton came and embraced her with the warmth of a woman who was absolutely certain she had been right about something. "You look well," Dorothea said, with a significance that was clear. "I am well," Wilhelmina said, with a directness that she had earned. Dorothea looked at Joel, who was standing nearby holding Tom, who had woken and was examining the brass buttons on Joel's coat with scientific intensity. "He's good for you," Dorothea said quietly. "I'm good for him too," Wilhelmina said. Dorothea laughed, a full and delighted laugh. "Yes, you are," she said. "Yes, you are." January brought the plains winter in full, and they went through it the way they had gone through the one before, with the competence and shared effort of a household that had worked out its own particular way of functioning. The long evenings were for planning and talking and reading. Joel had a good collection of agricultural almanacs and surveying texts, and she had brought her own small library from Ohio that had survived every hardship, because books were the one thing she had refused to categorize as a luxury, even in the worst times. Clara was reading above her level and had decided she wanted to be a teacher, a development that she announced with the finality of a person who has completed an internal process and is now presenting results. Joel took this announcement with the seriousness it deserved, asked her several questions about it, and then the following week came home with a second-hand McGuffey's reader that he had found in Wichita, 2 grades above where she was, which Clara received with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Wilhelmina watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway with a full heart and said nothing, and went back to the stew she was making, and thought about Thomas, about whether he could see this, about whether it would have seemed to him like a betrayal or like exactly what it was, life continuing past loss, not erasing what had been but adding to it, building the kind of story that does not have just one chapter but continues to be written by the people who are still here. She thought he would have understood. Thomas Hadley had been a man who believed in the promise of the land and the continuation of things, and he had married a woman who would not give up, and she had not given up, and this was what that looked like from the inside. In February, Wilhelmina realized she was expecting again. She told Joel on a Tuesday evening, which was not a remarkable day, just a Tuesday, which she thought was right. The remarkable things in her life had begun to happen on ordinary days. Joel put down the almanac he was reading and looked at her with the open expression that had replaced his habitual evenness in moments that required it. He reached across the table and covered her hands with his. "Good?" he asked in the same way he had asked the first time. "Very good," she said. Clara, who had an uncanny ability to appear precisely when significant things were being said, materialized in the doorway. "Another brother or sister?" "Possibly," Wilhelmina said. Clara considered. "I've had the brother experience now. I think a sister would be interesting new information." "We'll see," Joel said. Clara accepted this as sufficient and went back to her book, And Wilhelmina met Joel's eyes across the table and they both smiled. And Tom made a small sound from his crib in the corner that might have been agreement or might have been wind, but which Clara called out from the other room was definitely agreement. The new baby came in September, on a cool, clear morning when the barley was already golden, and the wheat was being talked about by the whole county again, the second strong year in a row on the Hadley South field. It was a girl, as healthy and demanding as her brother had been, with Joel's dark hair and Wilhelmina's exact expression of focused determination. Clara, upon being presented with her sister, said, "Hello, I'm Clara. I've been here longest and I know the most, but I'll teach you everything," which the baby received with the wide, unfocused attentiveness of the newly arrived. They named her Ruth, for the mule who had watched from the fence with such persistent superiority, but also because the name meant something, meant loyalty and steadiness and the willingness to go where the people you love go. The South Field that autumn was the best it had ever been. The second well had changed everything on the north section, and the careful management of the soil over 2 years was showing itself in yields that made Dobbs at the general store shake his head and say that he had remembered himself and said Mrs. Bishop with only a slight pause that she had a gift for this ground. She did. She had always had it. She had just needed the chance to prove it, and a barn roof she could trust, and a cow at her gate before sunrise as a kind of beginning. Life in Caldwell in those years was not without its hardships, because it never was and never would be. The climate was unforgiving, and the economics of frontier farming were narrow, and the world was large and indifferent in the ways that the world always is. But she had the land and the work and the right person beside her and 4 good walls and enough, which was the word she kept coming back to. Enough, and then better than enough, and then something that deserved a different word entirely, something closer to flourishing. On the evening of their second anniversary, she and Joel sat on the porch of the Hadley farmhouse, the one she had kept and maintained and improved and refused to give up in the last of the September light, with the children in bed and the harvest in and the accounts settled, and the land before them doing what the land does in the evening, going soft and golden and still. He had given her nothing for the anniversary except his company, which was his way, and she had given him nothing except supper and her company in return, which was hers. They sat in the 2 plain wooden chairs she had owned since before her marriage to Thomas, chairs that had been on this porch through everything, and they were quiet for a while in the good way. "Do you remember what you said to me," she said eventually, "when I brought you the $3? You told me you couldn't accept charity," he said, without having to think about it. "You said it wasn't charity, you said it was a correction." "It was." She looked at him. "You know what I think now." He looked at her with those steady, dark eyes. "I think it was the beginning," she said, "of the correction." He thought about that for a moment in the way he thought about things. "The beginning of something," he said, "the beginning of this." The September evening went on around them, the light going and the stars coming, the way it had always gone and always would, indifferent and magnificent and utterly itself. The land was quiet and the wheat stubble was silver in the early starlight, and somewhere beyond the east fence a nighthawk called its flat, repeated note. "I'd do it again," he said. She looked at him. "Leave the cow at the gate in the dark." "Everything," he said simply. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they sat on the porch of the farm she had saved and the life she had built, and the night settled in over the Kansas plain, soft and deep and full of everything that was going to keep on happening, all the mornings ahead of them, all the ordinary extraordinary days, all the work and the weather and the children growing and the land coming back year after year as it does, as it always does. If you give it what it needs and stand by it through the dry years and believe, with the particular faith of farmers and of people who have loved and lost and chosen to love again, that what you put in the ground will come up green. And it would. It would come up green every spring, on the Hadley South field in the Bishop South pasture, for years and years and years, rooted in good soil, tended by good hands, proof that some things belong where they are placed, and that placing them correctly in the dark before the sun comes up, with no audience and no requirement of thanks, is one of the finest things a person can do in this world.